long as the person that's been in the water? How long? We think half an hour, maybe an hour, we don't know.
In the early hours of the 21st of October 1993, 50-year-old Russell Causley was reported missing at sea.
I made inquiries with the ferry company and found that a Mr. R. Russell had made a last-minute check-in for that ferry back to the UK. Immediately that sort of sprang alarm bells.
Russell was in fact alive and well. His disappearance had been a scam to try and benefit from an insurance payout worth over £750,000.
I did not believe in any shape or form that my father would have faked his death.
There isn't many people out there that do what my grandfather done, right? You know, you don't automatically go, I know what they're doing, committing insurance fraud, aren't they?
This attempted fraud, however, was just the beginning of the story when it kick-started a search for Russell Causley's wife, Carol, who'd been missing for over 8 years.
My father did phone me, and his opening line to me was, "Well, Samantha, the police have just left, and they still have not arrested me for the murder of your mother." And that was his opening sentence.
Russell and his wife, Carol Packman, had been married for 3 years when in 1968 their daughter Sam was born.
I was brought up as a very independent child. I was an only child. I was reading and I was doing puzzles upside down at the age of 2 because I found pictures, being able to see the pictures, boring. I used to get sent to the shop on my own. I could answer the phone. I have way more, happy memories with my father than what I do with my mother. Absolutely adored him.
Her dad had intense focus on her in terms of education, and it almost feels as if he saw Samantha as an extension of himself, like, this is mine, this is my possession, and look what my possession can do. And she also had a sense of really wanting to please her dad and get more of that positive feedback.
He was very strict, but very involved, had high expectations, didn't like lying. He meted out so many severe beatings to me for lying or losing of something or whatever it may well be.
She describes her father as being quite nasty if he believed that she was lying, which is so fascinating because he told one of the biggest lies, which was when he fakes his own death.
There's no way that I would ever portray, my childhood as some dark dungeon sort of view. It wasn't like that at all. But I think certainly it's not the way I would bring up my child.
So my grandfather, how he parented my mother and how he instilled right and wrong, it was very much with an iron fist. If you refused to eat your dinner, he'd pour the food over my mum's head. I look at pictures and I see someone either side that is incredibly, they dress nice. They're the epitome of what anybody from outside would say is your typical white middle-class family. But we had some very, very dark skeletons, clearly.
Both Russell and Carol had been brought up in the idyllic Surrey Hills in the south of England.
He was born in Hazelmere, in Surrey, and he was the youngest of 3 brothers and a sister. His sister told me that he could charm the hind leg off a donkey and sell it to the Arabs.
My grandfather was convicted of GBH at a very, very young age, 18 odd years of age. So if we was to look at my grandfather in terms of what motivates him, it's quite simple really. It's money, it's greed, it's wealth, it's power.
Carol, however, had a much straighter background.
She was born in Farnham and her parents moved to Reading. When she was older, she went to work in a factory and that's where she met Russell. He ended up moving into the family home because he'd been thrown out of his previous digs. Carol's mum told me later that Russell was extremely disruptive to the whole family and the parents wanted him out. He made their lives so difficult, and they moved out. They got married. She was besotted with him.
We were a very insular family, just by the fact that we weren't in this country very much. My parents always had a house in this country, and sometimes we came back and we would be back for a little period of time, and then that would be it. We would then be off. We emigrated to Canada for a week once. We landed on a Saturday, was due to start school on the Wednesday. My father then said to me, don't bother starting school on the Wednesday because we're leaving the country again the following Saturday. By the age of 7, I was in Germany. I was put into a German school, didn't speak any German. Became fluent in German within 6 months. I couldn't really give you that many scenarios of a good relationship with my mother or happy daughter-mother times. That got worse as I got older and became more opinionated and argumentative, as teenage children do. My father put more energy into me than what my mother did, but she wasn't a nasty person, though. She was a very quiet person.
My grandmother would regularly receive beatings, and these were intense beatings, physical beatings. These days we now know it's coercive control. The behaviours that my grandfather was demonstrating were very, very clear for everybody to see, but they weren't recognised that that was right and that was wrong, and that isn't how you treat a man treats his wife, or someone who loves another treats their partner. If we go back into the medical records, Mum wouldn't remember this. She would now, but she wouldn't have remembered it at the time. But she was a toddler. She was 2 when he broke her arm. We don't know which parent did it, but it's more than likely it was her father.
He was arrogant. He thought he was better than other people. He was very much into his status symbols, the Rolex watches, and he had a personalised number plate. He liked to have good cars. It was all about appearance.
By 1984, when Sam was 15, the family had returned to the UK and settled in Bournemouth on the south coast.
They bought a house in Westbourne in Bournemouth, and we came down and he set up his own business with somebody else that he'd met. And then they needed to employ some staff, and one of those people that he employed was Patricia.
Patricia was Russell's 26-year-old secretary.
They began an affair, and he'd been unfaithful before, but on this occasion he moved Trish into the family home. That kind of increased the tension. What would happen is Carol would go out and Sam would keep watch to alert them when she was coming back. I don't think they were taking too much trouble to hide it, this affair.
So now you've got Russell, Carol, Patricia and Samantha all under one roof. And Russell and Patricia are having an affair. Now just think of the abusive nature of those relationships under that one roof. Think about the tensions and the conflict that would have been going on, or bubbling under the surface and coming to the fore.
Only 6 months before my mother went missing, I was in a children's home because I received a beating like no other. So he, and that wasn't, through any fault of my own. That was more down to what the adults were up to and me getting involved in that.
Mum was made a ward of court. She was put into care. My grandfather contacted my mum directly while she was at the children's home, encouraged my mum to change her statement to the police. The police couldn't pinpoint specific blame, so there was no prosecution. My mum was released from social services.
When Samantha returned home, relations between her parents and Patricia had got even worse.
There were some very heated arguments. Then there was some really weird times of tranquility of how the 3 of them, or the 4 of us, would live together, such as, Patricia having her gin and tonic and my mother having her sherry and my father having his whiskey, and, all rather sort of just weird.
My grandmother wanted out. She'd seen the solicitors to discuss the divorce. Unfortunately, my grandfather was the type of person that wouldn't allow another person to have one over on him.
The last known sighting of Carol was June the 14th, 1985. And on that day, she visited a doctor for a routine appointment, and she went to see a solicitor. And she asked the solicitor about getting a divorce. And that seems to have been the trigger for whatever happened.
The last thing that he was going to endure was a woman making a fool of Russell. And she paid her life for it. She paid her life for it.
My father and I had gone to London for the day, and when we came back, there was a letter on the side in the kitchen purporting to be from my mother. As far as I can remember, is that it was in her writing. Whether it was or not, I do not know. And basically she just said that she'd had enough and that she was leaving and that she wasn't coming back, and she left her wedding ring on top of that note. And that was it. That's how we found out she was gone. And my father was there, and he followed me because I ran upstairs to see how Gone was gone, and she hadn't taken anything. But the bedroom was in what I now believe to now be stage set, wardrobe doors all open.
Russell claimed Carol had simply walked out. Her sudden disappearance wasn't seriously questioned until 8 years later, when Russell himself disappeared.
In October 1993, I was working as a shift sergeant and was then asked by the duty inspector to investigate a man reported missing at sea.
Russell had by this time taken his partner Patricia's surname as his own. Russell Causley, as he was now known, was reported to have fallen overboard.
So on board the vessel with Russell Causley was Patricia Causley, their family solicitor, and one other lady.
In the early hours of the 21st of October 1993, 50-year-old Russell Causley was missing at sea.
The lifeboat from Guernsey was dispatched and went out there and actually did locate the yacht with the survivors on board and commenced this overnight search for Russell Causley.
Russell's daughter Sam was the first person to be informed.
That evening, 2 police officers turned up at the house, and I opened up the door and they said, "Are you Samantha Gillingham?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "We've got some really bad news for you. You need to contact Guernsey Police. We're sorry to report that your father has been reported as missing, presumed dead."
The other people on the yacht, including Russell's partner Patricia, were the only witnesses to the accident at sea.
I knew that Patricia and one other person on board the vessel had been taken to the hospital in Guernsey. I went on to the room in the ward that Patricia Causley was in, but she didn't really show her face. She covered her face with her hands. She appeared to be crying, and she was banging her head on the bedside table, which I thought was slightly odd. I thought that she would be wanting to say, "Have you got any information?" But that question never came out. I didn't find her behaviour to be very convincing of a person who had potentially lost her husband at sea. But a police officer has to be very careful because people do behave in different ways to tragedy.
Russell's lawyer, who had also been aboard the yacht, was staying in the same hotel as Patricia.
I made this arrangement to see them early the next morning, but when I arrived at the hotel in St Peter Port at 8 a.m, they were actually leaving and getting into a taxi, and I said, "Where are you going?" I was going to give you an update, and he replied that they'd booked an aeroplane back to the UK and they were flying back to England and that he would be in touch, which struck me as very odd.
I didn't understand why Patricia had left Guernsey, because I was thinking, why on earth would you leave the area where your husband was last seen? Surely you'd be out there with the bloody boats yourself and saying, "Search again." What do you mean you haven't found him? We need to search again. And you're then thinking about him being eaten by sharks or flipping whatever else it may well be. Trying to cope with death, just thinking about death.
Whilst Sam was dealing with her father's disappearance, Phil went looking for Russell's legal next of kin, her mother, Carol.
I wanted to know where Carol was, and I wanted to let her know everything that had happened. A number of years had gone by, and I felt that it was time, perhaps, that there should be a reunion between mother and daughter.
As his investigation continued, Phil found evidence that started to make him wonder if Russell had really been lost at sea at all.
I made inquiries with the ferry company that runs between the Channel Islands and the south coast of mainland UK, and found that a few hours before the yacht set sail for Ushant, that a Mr. R. Russell had made a last-minute check-in for that ferry back to the UK. Immediately that sort of sprang alarm bells. With these suspicions growing, I thought it would be best to try and put the insurance companies on notice. And within weeks of the missing person report, there was a claim that came in of just short of £1 million on Mr. Causley's life.
It wasn't beyond the realms of feasibility.
I asked for an interview with Patricia Causley, and Patricia gave no comment answers, except when I said to her specifically, and I looked her in the eyes and asked her, "Can you tell me where I might find Carol Packman now?" And that was the only time that she turned her gaze from off towards the desk and looked me directly in the eye and said, "To be honest with you, Sergeant Fuller, I don't think you will ever find Carol." It sent a shiver down my spine, because I took that to mean that Carol was no longer alive, and that I needed to prove that Carol no longer existed so that we could extend it from beyond a missing person inquiry into a murder investigation.
My father did phone me, and his opening line to me was, "Well, Samantha, the police have just left, and they still have not arrested me for the murder of your mother." And that was his opening sentence.
In 1995, Russell Causley stood trial for attempted insurance fraud at Southwark Crown Court. Russell received a 2-year jail sentence. His lawyer accomplice was also given jail time, while Patricia was handed a suspended sentence.
So how did you get sucked into it?
I love him.
From the point of the police first ended turning up on my doorstep to the point of when we finally got in front of a court to then go through that trial, it's a long time. And there's many levels that you go through during that period of time.
With her father in prison, Sam now had to face up to the reality of a police investigation into her mother's disappearance.
I couldn't stop crying. I made myself very ill because of just trying to process that, that your father's missing, presumed dead, and then 4 months later he's found alive and well, but you've had a mother at that stage that had been missing for 8.5 years, and then all of a sudden that changes.
If losing one parent wasn't bad enough, imagine losing two. And then what you actually realise is that, the plot twist, right, is the fact that actually the person you thought was dead is actually alive, and the person you thought was alive is actually dead. And it just so happens that the person you thought was dead is actually alive, is also the killer.
It still evokes exactly the same emotion as what it did at any stage in this.
As police looked back over the files, they discovered that shortly after Carol had disappeared in 1985, someone claiming to be her had visited Dorset Police.
Someone, walks into a police station wearing a wig, with a young girl on her arm purporting to be my mum, and says, "I'm not missing. I just don't want to be contacted." And so for 8 years, no one knew, and no one searched for her because they thought that was her will and her wish. And I think that that's what makes it even more difficult, because my grandfather theoretically had an 8-year head start on us, and he's always had 8 years of head start on the police. So to make up those 8 years is nigh near impossible.
Police continued their inquiries to try and find out where Carol was, if there was any evidence she was alive. And they investigated very, very thoroughly.
Unfortunately, obviously, each Carol Packman that they thought that they had found that they thought was my mother, and I think there was around about half a dozen of them that Guernsey police said, we found somebody else, we're going to go and see if it is her, and each time they came back and said no, that was not her. So, but I think, yeah, it most probably took a good year for us to realise that the seriousness of her disappearance.
Not one trace was found of her. Then they also found some prisoners who'd known him in prison who were prepared to talk.
In prison, he boasted to fellow inmates he had committed a murder which was better than an Agatha Christie.
The only trouble is that they had 3 different stories that Russell had given them. One of the confessions he gave was that he'd gassed her and put a plastic bag over her head, dissolved the body in acid. In one of them, he just had an argument that got out of hand. One of them, he dropped the body down a hole in the New Forest. Could be that none of those are true.
Despite Carol's body not being found, police uncovered enough evidence to charge Russell with her murder. In 1996, he stood trial at Winchester Crown Court.
The weight of circumstantial evidence just built and built. Sam gave evidence. She was very emotional. It must have been a hard thing to do, to give evidence against her own father.
I was absolutely petrified. I can remember being really quite scared, and my father as well, smirking at me, you know, whilst I was giving evidence, and I did actually say to him, you know, you may well smirk. It wasn't funny. It was huge as well. The courtroom was massive.
I don't envy Mum. What a brave woman. Yeah, I don't know. I think that would kill me. But I think that, you know, with Mum is, I think it brought her onto her knees. I think it dropped her onto her knees.
Appealing a number of times.
Russell certainly behaved as if the rules didn't apply to him. He bent the rules, he broke the rules. So his own needs came front and centre as number one, numero uno, most important person in the world. And that speaks volumes about how he saw everybody else. They were either with him or they were discarded.
You almost feel as if that you have to get your battle clothing back on again. Your protective armour needs to be on, because you know that emotionally this is going to be hard work, and you know that mentally it's going to be hard work. I've got my own life to try and sort out, do you know what I mean? And things that I want to achieve myself. It's almost like having 2 separate lives running in tandem.
In 2003, the reliability of the evidence provided by one of the prisoners was brought into question, and the conviction was overturned. Russell was released.
We did have panic alarms here that were put in, not at our request. There were various members of the family that did have panic alarms put in. They considered, obviously, there was enough of a threat to us. But I think, though, that when I look back on it in hindsight, is that he would have been a fool to have done anything. But then again, we also have to take into account, to measure what this man actually was capable of doing.
School. And this is a little boy who's completely innocent. He has no responsibility at all for what went on before.
It was a sad time. I tried committing suicide a few times. And mental health is something I've battled with. You know, from an early age, never got over those demons. And it shapes your perception, it shapes how you trust people, it shapes who you have as your friends. They'll never understand, the bullies will never understand the impact that they had on my life.
A decade before, police had seized a box of possessions from Russell and released them to the family. Inside was a notebook which Neil believed Russell had written in.
It sat under my bed for 10 years without being opened. And then I became really curious. I wanted to understand. The best way to get into someone's head and understand someone is how they write. And ultimately, I wanted to understand what was in the book, i.e. was there any clues that could lead to my grandmother? And I started reading it. It was very hard to read. It's all to do with crime, okay? It's all to do with death, ultimately. But he speaks about having a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little boy kidnapped by a paedophile ring, ultimately. That's the crux of it. And I had my little teddy bear, apparently, with me to keep me safe. I didn't just have a threat of, a gang of bullies, of peers my age and older. I now had also the real substantial threat that I could have a convicted killer that tries to kidnap me and obviously then takes it to a paedophile ring. So at that point it was enough's enough. On both sides, I'm out. I said to mum and dad, I was like, I can't do this. I remember just sitting there, I was just like, I can't do this. I can't.
When Russell Causley was released on bail awaiting a retrial, his family were constantly afraid he could be a danger to them. Media interest in the story was at an all-time high when he faced judgment again.
In the spring of 2004, we had the second trial. I went down to Exeter on my own.
There was Russell in the dock, in a smart suit, with his Daily Telegraph. There was a very charged atmosphere, I think, because we were all kind of on tenterhooks thinking that he might actually get off this time.
For a while, Russell Causley believed he could get away with murder. But though he arrived at court today a free man, a few hours later he was sentenced to life for the second time in 9 years for the murder of his wife 19 years ago.
The judge said that he would have to serve a minimum of 16 years before anybody should even consider his release. But she added, I'm not suggesting you'll ever be fit for release.
Described by the judge as a ruthless, self-centred and calculating killer, tonight Russell Causley's back behind bars, this bizarre case now over.
I've had no doubt, never had any doubt. He is a nasty piece of work.
Obviously, it had been in the media again because he had been convicted for the second time. And I think it was then us just trying to calm things back down again and then just get on with life as normal as we possibly could. Neil left school with no qualifications. By then, Neil was becoming increasingly uncontrollable because he was now turning into a young man and had a fair amount of anger that was inside him. I think most probably that he thought that we had failed him as well because we as parents weren't able to actually stop what he was going through at that time.
I was either going to spend the rest of my life in a prison cell or I was going to spend my life in a graveyard. All because of my upbringing.
The 16-year sentence Russell Causley had received was backdated to his first trial, meaning that by 2012, his possible release was imminent.
I was very upset. I didn't think that this was correct, that my father was being considered for parole.
You start doing your research in terms of, okay, then, well, how is this operating? How does the process work? He could come out soon.
Everybody felt enormous sympathy for Sam.
Sam wanted her father to remain behind bars, but was aware only he knew what had happened to her mother, Carol. Suddenly, after almost 30 years, Russell made a confession to police.
My father then sat there in early 2014 and wrote a 5 and a bit page, best part 6-page confessional stroke statement, which he typed out, signed, dated. When we first read that confessional letter, we genuinely actually felt quite sorry for the guy, which might surprise people, but I felt that he was trying to be truthful.
The contents were gruesome. It was horrible.
In his confession, Russell admitted to killing Carol, burning her body, and scattering her ashes in a number of locations nearby.
We're now having to go through the thought process of the fact that my mother had potentially been burnt. Was it possible for her to be burnt? How long would it take for her to be...
During their campaigning, Neil had a son. For Sam, it was a moment to reflect on what could have been.
I don't know what sort of grandmother that my mother would have been, because I know that she found parenting difficult enough as it was. But certainly for us, it's been really important to make sure that we don't intentionally cause him the harm or the stress that we've had to go through. But yeah, he's awesome. Yeah.
Becoming a father, I think it's that realisation moment. I can't rewrite history, no matter how ugly it is, and how much I'd like to. I can't rewrite it. So it's something which will always be there.
I have no interest in a relationship with my father. I have no interest in that whatsoever. That I didn't feel that this had been finalised. I've never felt that justice has been served. You've held him, and it's just all been sort of like, it's just in like a holding cell, as it were. But ultimately, what we set out to do, which was to find my mother, we still have not satisfied that.
She's missed out that chance to rebuild a relationship with her mother, and she lives with the guilt.
And the adult Samantha feels guilty for what happened with Mum, and could she have done something different? Of course not. Samantha is a victim of Russell's heinous behaviour and treatment of both herself and her mum.
In October 2020, after tirelessly campaigning to keep Russell behind bars, the family received some unexpected news.
I had a phone call to say that he'd been released, and an email to say he'd been released. And I took off in my car.
His family don't love him. That's what the first thing I said to the police. Tell him, from me, his family do not love him. You know, the fact is, he's got no family. We don't like you. We don't love you. We don't respect you. So that's what your family think, let alone what a stranger thinks, mate. That's your own flesh and blood.
So I phoned up whoever the spokesperson was for the parole board, and I said, how can this be? You know, aren't people supposed to, when they go to prison, surely part of it is punishment, but part of it's also about coming to terms with what you've done and acknowledging it and saying you're sorry for it. He'd never shown a shred of remorse. And he said the criterion was they had to be satisfied that that person wasn't a threat, was not a threat to anybody else. So that's all they were taking into consideration.
My grandmother still isn't found. We still need to find her. The fight isn't over. So they may have released Russell. That's fine. We'll have to accept that. It's a bitter pill, but the fight continues, and here we are.
Over time, the family have tried to put the pieces together, and they've identified locations they feel need to be searched further, including
Me wrong.
You're not destroying me. My life still continues. I just have this. There's also
years. He became more controlling of her behaviour, of who she was seeing, of what she was wearing.
Lee Ford was also abusing his stepchildren.
The kids actually who they were at school with was telling us that they used to come in with bruises and things.
My feelings are that he was sexually abusing her.
When Leslie tried to escape the marriage, she paid the ultimate price.
She was going to leave with all the children, and I think he just couldn't take it.
Statistics show that if a female is to die, the likelihood it's going to be at the hands of a partner or ex-partner.
I know he was abusive to my sister, but I didn't think he would actually kill him.
On a cool early autumn day in 2000, Peter Wyatt received a phone call about his sister Leslie.
The first I heard that Leslie was missing was One of my uncles phoned me and said, "Leslie with you?" And I said, "No, she's not with me." It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when I phoned the police and reported her missing. Actually, I didn't report her missing. I told the police that he'd killed her.
He was Peter's brother-in-law, Lee Ford. The family of 8 had been living in a bungalow in the village of Carnkye in the west of Cornwall. Lee, Leslie, their 2 young children together, and Leslie's children from her first marriage, Sarah Jane, Anne-Marie, Stephen and Craig.
The last time Leslie and the 4 older children were seen alive was the 31st of August 2000. And over the next days and weeks, Lee Ford started to do things, started to lay down the tracks to make people believe that she'd left him.
I phoned the house a few times, then I did get a phone call back from Lee. He goes, "I know she's with you." And I put her on the phone. And I said, "She's not with me." And I've not seen her. She wasn't there, was she? He knew quite well where she was at the time. But I don't know how someone could talk to you like that.
He actually positioned himself as the victim, saying that Leslie had left him and he, had been left with their 2 children and she'd taken off and left with her 4 children from a previous relationship.
He told me that she'd gone off with a guy in a car with the kids in a very posh car.
The last time I seen Lee Ford, he came in to demand Sarah's wages. He said because they're leaving, and then I think I started up in my message to Sarah saying, "What's going on? Where are you?" One of my last messages to Sarah was, "Are you still alive?"
He rang the Helston Community College and said the children were ill and couldn't come in. He then apparently picked up the books that the children had at home and things like that, returned them to the school and said they wouldn't be back.
He took all the kids' clothes and stuff around to my mum's, of Leslie's. And my mum actually put all the stuff straight up in the attic. She didn't even think about it. And a lot of the evidence was up in my mum's attic. The duvet and bits and pieces with the blood and that on, where he beat Leslie before he killed her. Don't know how anyone could face someone after you've killed their kids, their daughter and their grandkids, really. Lee was actually in touch with one of his ex-girlfriends as well at the time, after he killed Leslie and that, trying to get a relationship back with them.
He killed Leslie and her 4 children and then calmly moved on to flirting with another woman.
Peter Wyatt did not believe his sister Leslie had simply fled the relationship.
In my heart, actually, I knew where she would have been on my doorstep if she'd left him. Well, Leslie wouldn't have left 4 kids. She would have took all 6. She wouldn't have left without any of her kids.
Family meant everything to Leslie Ford. She and her older brother Peter were always close.
We used to talk on the phone nearly every week, and we were really close. She used to fight my battles at school. If I got picked on, she'd pick on the person who was picking on me. She started me smoking, actually. I caught her smoking when she was younger. So I threatened her that I was going to tell my parents if she didn't let me have a fag. And that was it. I started at 13, smoking. I carried on and she stopped. But we didn't have an easy childhood anyway. It was a hard childhood we had.
We don't know very much about Leslie and Peter's upbringing, but Peter does describe it as a very difficult childhood, which gives us a clue that both of them, to some extent, were suffering within it. And I think what that tends to do for siblings is they tend to cling closer together as a survival mechanism. We have each other's backs.
When we had our first child, we used to phone her and she used to tell us what to do, you know. She was really close to me. Leslie wanted a big family. She loved kids. Our kids were the world to her.
Leslie would soon meet the first love of her life.
Around 1982, Michael Tranter and Leslie Wyatt used to get a bus together in Telford, and that's where they met. Leslie was 18 at the time, Michael was 20.
They started talking on the bus and that, and she started going out with him and things. And then they ended up getting married.
Between 1983 and 1987, Michael and Leslie had 4 children together. The oldest was Sarah Jane, then they had Anne-Marie, then Stephen, and the last one to come along was Craig.
It's a picture of Leslie and Sarah when Sarah was first born. Before she gave birth, when she was in labour, I had to drive up to Mike's and Leslie's house to pick her up and take her into hospital. So that happened with all 4. She was over the moon, and with all her kids, actually. She was a great mother.
As the children grew, siblings Peter and Leslie remained close.
When I used to go up there and go and visit them, the 2 girls used to bring their hairbrushes to me and get me to brush their hair. And they had nice, lovely long hair, and so they used to like me doing it.
After 7 years together, Leslie's marriage to Michael ended in divorce in 1989.
About a year later, Leslie was in a relationship with a man, and I'll describe it as problematic. He was stealing from her. And a man called Lee Ford come along, who seemed to know this man somehow. And a bit like a knight in shining armour, he came along and he threw the man out of the house.
And I think that the role that Lee played in her life at this particular point was almost as a romantic aggressor, protector figure. When you're in a vulnerable situation, you're in a difficult relationship and you're trying to figure out a way out, somebody comes in and says, I will save you. That is highly attractive.
You know, he was offering stability, he was offering calm, he was offering help with her children and love, ultimately. And then red flags did start to present.
He seemed to be okay, seemed to be fine, nice, polite. And that's really all you can ask for at the time, but you just don't know what's behind the person or what's going on behind closed doors, really, do you?
When Peter Wyatt first met his sister Leslie's new partner, Lee Ford, he saw no reason to be worried.
He was very bright, very brainy, very clever. Work-wise, he just potted around. One minute he was working, the next minute he wasn't working.
Leslie and Lee Ford developed a relationship which was quite whirlwind. Within a few short months, they were living together, and shortly after that, they got married.
The relationship seemed to be all right at the beginning, and then he got very possessive. He wouldn't let her wear certain things and do certain things. And if she'd gone upstairs and put something on and came down and he didn't like it, he'd make her change it.
So his behaviours early on were sort of showing signs of coercive control. He started becoming restrictive with Leslie about who she was seeing and talking to.
It was difficult, actually, to get Leslie away from him. He was always there with you all the time, and like he was missing out on something.
Ultimately, perpetrators of domestic abuse are doing these behaviours in order to get as much control over the victim as possible. They're controlling what they look like, who they're seeing, and ultimately they're isolating them.
She was quiet with Lee, and she used to go like this with her fingers, and a lot. And when she used to do this when she was a kid, it was always that she was worried and frightened. And she used to do that quite a bit with Lee around. Like, I better be careful what I say. She hated her photo being taken, so the impression on her face is go away type of thing. Got her fingers in her mouth or biting her nails, and in the background, just lurking over the back end of the sofa, is Lee peering over the back of it. So it's quite a weird photo in some ways.
On the face of it, Lee appeared all right most of the time. And I think also Lee was incredibly good at wearing a mask, of being charming, of looking like a great dad, of looking like a great partner. There are some hints that potentially these are red flags, where Leslie would come down wearing something and Lee would tell her to get changed. This is the early signs of a controlling person. But from Peter's point of view, how much of this did he actually see a lot of the time?
Leslie and Lee got married in 1990. Not long after, Lee became physically violent towards Leslie.
She just told me that Lee used to beat her and things. He used to drink quite a bit, and he used to actually, we think, actually used to take some drugs as well.
During their relationship, Leslie did try to get out of it. She went to women's refuges, she went to family. She did try and break away from that relationship, which was not healthy.
Peter and his family soon felt they had to protect Leslie from their new brother-in-law.
And my brother actually used to go round and get him out of the house, change the locks and things. I'd actually come from Hampshire all the way to Telford and done the same quite a few times as well. But then 3-4 days later, she'd let him back in.
I think for Peter it was incredibly difficult and frustrating to be on the outside looking in, knowing that his sister was being hit. But I think when you are the person on the outside and you can see what needs to be done, what you don't really see is the complexity and the trauma that's going on for Leslie. She would have been involved in a relationship with someone where she felt that there was love there were children there. It was complex for her to just suddenly go, right, that's it, I'm out.
Leslie just wouldn't be without him. That's the problem. When I knew the violence was happening and he was hitting her around, you know, you can only do so much. If the person won't leave, you can't force them to leave.
Leslie's brother being aware of the behaviour, I think all he could have done was be a support network for Leslie, but ultimately you are at a risk of, if you push yourself into the situation, potentially making it worse, potentially isolating that person further.
I just had enough with her, really, in some ways, and just cut ties with her a little bit.
In 1992, Leslie and Lee had their first child together, who was a son.
Leslie was more tied than ever to her abusive husband, who was now playing father to 5 children.
With the kids, he seemed fine, and the kids seemed fine with him. But then that might have been scared, I don't know. They were very quiet, not like normal kids. They were well behaved all the time. Lee was very good with the kids, playing and things like that. You wouldn't actually think there was anything wrong. They were really jolly. They seemed really jolly playing and things.
I think Lee was incredibly clever at manipulating those around him, because he needed them for his own ego supply, to think he's a great guy, to think he's charming, to think that he's got it all sorted out and all together. And Peter would be looking to those children to go, well, surely I would pick something up that wasn't quite right, or they would tell me. Those children were incredibly self-disciplined because they were terrified of Lee.
It's only after you realise what they might have been going through.
5 years into their marriage, Leslie tried to break away.
Eventually, in 1995, she made the big move. She took her and her 5 children and she moved to Cornwall without telling Lee where she was going.
So she was in Cornwall, actually, in a caravan, on a caravan park for a while. I didn't even know she was in Cornwall, actually, at first.
Leslie didn't tell many people where she'd moved to, but Lee was determined to find out. And he went about it in quite a clever way, actually.
He rang her mother, pretending to be a solicitor, trying to trace her, and he was given the address where the family were living in Bugle.
He manipulated family members, friends, to get the information that he wanted so that ultimately he could stalk Leslie and the children and obtain her new address, follow her, and convince her to get back with him.
He turned up on her doorstep and then must have persuaded her that he was sorry for what had happened before and he'd mended his ways. So she took him back in.
After getting his wife back, Ford seemed determined that Leslie would never leave him again. Peter would invite his sister to come and stay with him in Hampshire, 200 miles away from her home with Lee.
The kids were invited as well, and the kids weren't allowed to come. And Leslie did say that to me, that he's kept the kids there to make sure that I go back. So there was that part of him still there, that he was still controlling and possessive and making sure that actually she didn't do a runner from Cornwall, I suppose.
Shortly after Lee and Leslie Ford resumed their relationship, she became pregnant once again.
They had a daughter, so in total they now had 6 children in the house. Then around 1998, they all moved to a place called Conkai.
It was a secluded little bungalow in Conkai.
I would describe it as more a hamlet than a village. It's just a string of houses in a rural area.
Local journalist Colin Gregory became well acquainted with the village after the family was murdered.
I do wonder why somebody would pick Conkai, because in general, it's a place with few services, so you wouldn't choose it as a place to live. But you could choose it as a place to hide away. I would think that it was quite possible for Lee and Leslie Ford, together with the 6 children, to move into a place like that without other people being close enough to ask questions as to where they came from and what they were doing. Because basically he was trying to keep low, because I don't think he wanted any of the Tranter family really to know where he was and where the children were.
For years, Leslie's ex-husband Michael had no idea where his 4 children were living, and no one in the local area knew the family's history.
Today, there's joined up thinking, joined up working between all the police forces around the country. So it's easy for somebody from one police force to log onto a computer and see what information is held on someone around the country. But in 2000, that would have been very different. For the police in Cornwall to understand what information Telford police may have held on Leslie and Lee Ford and the family, it would have taken them to physically contact the police that cover Telford and ask for that information. It's not as simple as just logging onto a computer and finding it instantly.
To the untrained eye, the Ford family appeared to settle into the area without incident.
There was nothing on the outside unusual about Lee and Leslie. I don't think Leslie went out much, but people that I spoke to in the area just really described her as a really friendly, nice lady. It was difficult to find out much about him because obviously one thing was I don't think he told much about himself to other people. Lee used to drink quite heavily and used to go to a local cricket club.
We used to go and sit in the garage and watch telly in the garage and things out the way from the rest of the family, I've been told, and that you spend a lot of time there.
He did part-time jobs, so he was a bit of an odd job man, but also he was what they call casual worker at Falmouth Docks.
It's the first time I think I've known him to work, really, and he seemed happy doing it. But he seemed like a normal person, really.
Living in Cornwall, Leslie and Lee Ford seemed to lead a simple life. On the surface, at least, Leslie's children from her first marriage, Sarah Jane, Anne-Marie, Craig and Stephen, appeared to be thriving.
You can see, actually, from the photographs of them, they seem quite happy, well-adjusted children. Everyone, their friends at the school spoke highly of them.
The kids were very, very quiet around Lee, but they seemed happy. We were out in the garden playing basketball and things, and Lee was there playing it as well, and it seemed like a normal family in some ways, but you knew there was something underlying there still. I always knew that Lee had hit Leslie around. I didn't know anything was happening with the kids at all.
So people started to see signs of the children in school that, in hindsight, looking back now, were indications that not was all right in the house. For instance, Anne-Marie not wanting to do sports. Is that because she had bruises on her body that she didn't want people to see? Not being able to go with friends after school to their houses, and feeling that they had to get home quickly, especially when Lee Ford was picking them up.
He was involved with this woman and her children as a way to serve his needs. And as long as he had power and control and he could possess everybody and he jealously possessed them all, he was fine. As soon as anybody spoke up or spoke out, he would beat them into submission.
You don't even think about it really at the time. It's only after you realise what they might have been going through.
Leslie's eldest daughter, Sarah Jane, sought refuge at work.
I knew Sarah for about 2 years. That's when we worked together in McDonald's. We grew closer and closer all the time, and we just, become like best friends, and then grew into a relationship. You could tell that was an escape for Sarah to get away from her norm. Sarah always deflated when the shift was coming to the end. She was never happy to be picked up. It was just like the storm was coming in to take her away again.
Exactly what Sarah Jane was going through at home would only become clear later.
In early 2000, things started to take quite a worrying turn. Leslie started to have suspicions that Lee Ford was having sexual relationships with Sarah Jane, who was 17 at the time, and possibly Anne-Marie, who was 15.
Leslie phoned me, and she was concerned that Lee was actually messing around with the girls, and she needed to get away with the kids.
If those sexual abuse allegations are true, then I believe that Ford groomed Sarah Jane and ultimately committed acts of paedophilia and child sexual abuse.
I got hold of the Women's Refuge and got her a place with the kids. I got down there and Leslie said that she wasn't leaving him.
When Peter arrived in Cornwall, Leslie had changed her mind. She told him everything was fine, and she decided she was going to stay in that house with Lee.
Behind the scenes, though, Leslie Ford had decided to take action.
Sarah and Leslie actually went to a solicitor in between the June and when she was killed.
And she expressed to them concern that she had around the violence within their relationship and the potential sexual abuse from Lee Ford on Sarah Jane. And the solicitors actually approached social services and no action was taken.
It takes an awful lot for those victims to speak up and tell anybody because they are terrified. So in a situation like that, you can see that the domestic abuser will escalate and keep escalating, because what they've done is they've isolated that victim and taken away any support system that they may have had. So coercive control is one thing, it's terrible, but I think in this situation you can see how it escalated and how Leslie tried everything she could to protect her children, to protect herself.
No one knows if Lee Ford got wind of Leslie's meeting with the solicitor. But if he had, it may help to explain what happened next.
She was about to leave him. She was doing everything she could to get away from him, and he couldn't deal with that.
Everything had to go his way, and suddenly when things weren't going his way, he couldn't handle it.
In late August 2000, Leslie and the 4 eldest children vanished. Sarah Jane's then boyfriend Reese was potentially the last person to see her alive.
The last day I saw Sarah was the day I took my son, my baby son, down to see her. She had my son in her arms, and then her stepdad drove in, and she abruptly passed my son back to me. And then she sort of said her goodbyes and quickly scurried off and rushed off to the car and just jumped into the car. And then as the stepdad drove out of the car park, I remember vividly him looking at me as like he didn't like me. You could tell he didn't like me. And they drove off. I feel like Lee didn't know anything about me until that moment, like properly. I'm convinced Lee wanted to control her, yes.
It's all about him. It's about power. And when you don't do what I want, I will get rid of you and I will move on. And I think that's very much how Ford operated.
A month later, having not heard from Leslie, Peter reported his sister, his niece Sarah Jane, and her 3 siblings missing.
I spoke to Cornwall Police and they went round that was on a Friday.
Officers had been alerted by Mrs. Ford's concerned brother. She was last seen in August and her children hadn't attended school at all this term.
When the police were talking to Peter Wyatt, they would be trying to establish, is this out of the ordinary? Could Leslie have taken the kids and gone somewhere else? Especially if you're in the kind of relationship that she was in, and we know previously she had taken the children and left Lee Ford. But the difference this time was that nobody knew where she was.
And they went round on Saturday morning. And they had an inkling that he'd done it as well when they met him.
Detectives had been quizzing Lee Ford at this police station after he was arrested on suspicion of murder and are continuing to search the couple's bungalow at Carnkey, looking for clues as to what happened to the young mum and her teenage children.
Ford told the police the same story he told his brother-in-law Peter, that his wife and 4 stepchildren had simply left him.
The fact that nobody knew where Leslie was, the fact that she hadn't been in contact with anyone for so long would definitely have raised the suspicions. When they were looking at the phone usage of the family, there would have been none. Had Leslie made any cash withdrawals? She would have made none. Had she contacted any friends or family? No. The answers to all these questions would have raised their suspicions, would have started to make them really worry for the safety of Leslie and the children. You can't just assume that harm had come to them. But they would also be looking at the fact, had harm come to them? Were they killed? And if they are, what they would then look at is at whose hands. And one of those they would have looked at would have been Lee Ford. Statistics show that if a female is to die, the likelihood is it's going to be at the hands of a partner or ex-partner.
Probably 4 weeks after, Lee Ford must have been feeling quite worried about how police attention was turning to him. And I believe he put the two youngest children in a car and took them back to, took them up to his family in the Telford area.
And on the way back, on the Wednesday, if I'm right, he was arrested for benefit frauds.
Within hours of his arrest, Ford had confessed to murdering his wife Leslie and her 4 eldest children.
Detectives hunting for missing mum Leslie Ford and her 4 children have charged her husband, 33-year-old Lee Ford, with their murders.
In the small Cornish village of Carnkey, police were yet to find the bodies of Leslie Ford and her 4 teenage children. Under questioning, Lee Ford told police his version of what had happened to them.
He had an argument with Leslie, and she was in the bedroom, and he beat her around with a baseball bat. And he went out, actually made her a drink, took her some aspirins, and after he beat her around, then he went out into his garage. He seen this piece of rope hanging up in the garage, and he went back in. Then he killed Leslie with the piece of rope around her neck. Then he killed the kids one by one. It's very hard to even thinking of what they went through. Did they know that they were going to die or not? We don't know if all the kids were in the house at the same time and they were in their rooms and he called them out. Just don't know.
While Ford was making his confession, the police got a warrant to search the family's home in Carnkey.
The forensic team and the police went into the bungalow, and I had a phone call from the police, and we drove straight down to Cornwall then. So we just sat and waited to hear what was going on.
I remember I was walking into work, and I remember my colleagues saying to me, "Have you heard?" I had said, "Heard what?" And then they told me that the first set of bodies had been discovered in the woodshed.
Having carried out these killings, Lee had to decide what he was going to do with the bodies. He decided to take them out into the back garden where they had a woodshed, and he buried them under the wood, wrapped in bed sheets.
Leslie's body and the 2 boys were found there. At the time, there was no sign of the bodies of the two girls.
In my heart, I was praying to God and believing that she seen what had happened, she'd run and survived.
They found the bodies of the 3. And they had to, then Lee actually took them and showed them where he buried the other bodies, luckily, or they might have been completely gone.
He took Sarah Jane's body and Anne-Marie to about 4 or 5 miles from where they lived, and he buried them in a potato field. When the bodies were discovered, they'd been there for about 5 weeks. It was summer, and Lee Ford had taken steps by using lime to try and speed up the decomposition process. So the bodies wouldn't have been in a state where they'd be easily recognisable as to who was who.
I can't remember exactly how I found out Sarah had died and their bodies had been found. But I do remember being completely inconsolable. I remember being able to barely breathe. And even finding that out, I was still wishing it was a mistake, hoping they got the wrong person.
You just don't know what to believe. You're hoping that you're wrong, but in your gut, you know that you're right. And you hear this on the news. I heard it before this, you know, families are being murdered and things like this. And you think, God, how do they cope with it? How do they get through it? It's very hard. Even, 20-odd years later, it's still hard to think that they're not here. They would have had kids by now as well, her kids. she would have been a granny. It's very difficult, and especially being kids being killed. There was no need to kill the kids.
An important part of establishing how the family died would have been the post-mortem. The forensic pathologist said that these killings were carried out expertly and efficiently, which comes back to Lee Ford's state of mind. Was he in a rage or was he in control?
This was an almost strategic, one-by-one killing. He also said that none of the victims were aware of the other victim. None of them knew before they were murdered that the rest of their family had been. So if he's paying attention to that kind of level of detail and making sure, oh, I don't want that child to know that their sibling has died or their mother has been murdered, then that kind of, to me, implies like a level of rational thought that's going on throughout this and a strategic planning of locations of where these things are happening.
He wasn't running around like a lunatic. He was in control of his actions.
You trust people in your family, and it's hard to believe. I know he's abusive to my sister, but I didn't think he would actually kill him. You know, we're all human beings, and we've all got a soul, and you think, God, how can anyone do that to kids?
On the 24th of May 2001, having pleaded guilty to all 5 murders, Lee Ford was handed 5 life sentences, and he was given a minimum sentence of 27 years, which means that he would have to serve 27 years before he could apply for parole.
I think 27 years for 5 people is ridiculous. It's a stupid sentence. You know, it's not 5 life sentences, it's not even 1, I don't think. Leslie and the kids did have a life, but they're not no more. Because they were taken by someone who they thought would look after them. And they didn't. And why should he have a life in 27 when they still haven't got a life?
Ford's guilty plea meant he was never compelled to explain why he'd murdered his wife and stepchildren.
He's the only one who knows the truth.
I think Lee Ford pleaded guilty so that the details of various things would not come out in court. He didn't want the fact that he'd had an inappropriate relationship with his stepdaughter, not just inappropriate, illegal, in fact, read out.
Ford never explained his actions. He confessed his guilt, but he never explained the lead-up. He never explained the details of what happened. And call me cynical, but I see that as Ford's last ultimate act of control, because he's still controlling the narrative. They are no longer around to share their tales of what happened that day. By withholding that information, he is controlling the narrative. And in some ways, he's still therefore got control over Leslie, Sarah Jane, Anne-Marie, Craig, and Stephen.
Or whatever happened with Sarah. I think that was the last straw, really, when Leslie found out and it was going further and Leslie was going to leave him.
His control is about possessiveness. You do what I tell you to do, otherwise you don't live anymore. So he did that.
This one is the kid's grave and the headstone, which is black, and all 4 children are buried together.
The memorial service was at Truro Cathedral. There were the 4 small coffins down in front of the altar, and you just thought, this is terrible. There are 4 lovely kids who've lived a happy young life, and not only have their lives been robbed, but their grandparents, relations, and to some extent their younger brother and sister have been robbed of that.
At the funeral, journalist Colin met Michael Tranter, the father of the 4 murdered children.
He was in a terrible state. He just said, everything's been taken away from me. These 4 children were all I lived for. And now I've been robbed of that.
I took Mike down to Cornwall about a year or so ago, and we went back round and visited the places and where the kids were buried in the potato field and things as well. It was good. They've got the Remembrance Garden at the school, which is very nice. Me and Mike actually planted some new flowers there as well when we were there. And the parish actually have built a remembrance park there for the kids as well, with their name on a plaque in bits and pieces and that. So it's really nice to go back and see